Hello and welcome back to Mythic Dreamscapes. Tonight we're venturing into the cold grey mists of the north, to a time when longships carved through icy seas and warriors carved their names into legend. We're going to talk about a woman whose story has echoed through the centuries, a figure who stands at the very edge where history blurs into myth. Her name was Lagertha, and depending on who you ask, she was either a fearsome shield-maiden who led armies into battle, or perhaps something more. A goddess wrapped in mortal flesh, or maybe just a story told by a medieval monk with a flair for drama and a complicated relationship with women who refused to stay in their place. Either way, her tale is worth telling, because whether Lagertha walked the earth with a sword in her hand and blood on her boots, or whether she existed only in the imaginations of storytellers, she represents something powerful. She's a window into how the Vikings thought about courage, about gender, about power, and about what it meant to be remembered. Before we begin, let me set the scene properly. Imagine for a moment that you're standing on a rocky beach in western Norway, sometime around the year 830 or so. The wind coming off the sea is cold enough to sting your face, carrying with it the salt smell of the ocean and the faint scent of fish and seaweed. Behind you, dark forests climb up into mountains that seem to touch the low grey clouds. In front of you, the sea stretches out to the horizon, its surface choppy and steel-coloured under the overcast sky. This is a world very different from our own. There are no cities here, no roads connecting distant places, no centralised governments or standing armies. Instead, there are scattered settlements, farms clinging to the coastline or nestled in the valleys where the land is fertile enough to grow crops. There are fishing villages where people pull their living from the sea. There are trading posts where merchants exchange furs and amber and slaves for silver and iron and fine cloth from distant lands. The people who live here are tough, hardened by the environment and by the constant struggle for survival. Winter comes early and stays late this far north. The growing season is short. Food is never guaranteed. Every family knows hunger, knows loss, knows the cold fear of wondering whether the stored grain and dried fish will last until spring. But these people are also ambitious, adventurous, curious about the world beyond their shores. They're building ships, sleek vessels with shallow drafts that can navigate both the open ocean and the shallow rivers of Europe. They're developing navigation techniques that will allow them to sail out of sight of land and still find their way. They're beginning to look outward, to wonder what lies across the sea, what wealth might be found in the monasteries and towns of England and Francia and beyond. This is the beginning of what history will call the Viking Age, though the people living through it wouldn't have called it that. They're just living their lives, farming and fishing and trading and raiding when opportunity presents itself. They worship the old gods, the ones their ancestors worshipped, the ones who live in the great hall of Valhalla and ride across the sky and shape the fates of men. They tell stories around the fire on long winter nights, stories about heroes and monsters, about gods and giants, about the creation of the world and its eventual destruction at Ragnarok. And among those stories, passed down from generation to generation, are tales about women who were more than just wives and mothers. Women who picked up weapons and fought. Women who led warriors into battle. Women who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to place on them. So settle in, get comfortable. Let the world outside fade away for a while. We're going back to the 9th century, to the fjords of Norway, to a time when the northern kingdoms were young and brutal and alive with possibility. We're going to explore a world where the line between the human and the divine was thin, where legends were born in blood and fire, where a woman's worth could be measured in courage as well as in the children she bore. And we're going to meet a woman who, if the stories are true, refused to be anything other than extraordinary. Picture, if you will, the coast of Norway in the early 9th century. The land is harsh. Mountains rise like the bones of sleeping giants, their peaks dusted with snow even in summer. The forests are deep and dark, filled with pine and birch, and in the winter the silence is absolute. The fjords cut into the coastline like wounds, their waters black and cold, reflecting the grey sky above. This is not a gentle place. This is not a land that forgives weakness. The people who live here are equally unforgiving. They're farmers and fishermen, yes, but they're also warriors and raiders, sailors who can navigate by the stars and the feel of the wind. They worship gods who are as brutal and beautiful as the land itself. Odin, the All-Father, who hung from the world tree for 9 days to gain wisdom. Thor, with his hammer and his thunder. Freya, the goddess of love and war, because in this world, those two things are often the same. The social structure of Viking society is complex, built on a foundation of family, honor, and obligation. At the top are the kings and jarls, the rulers and great lords who command the loyalty of warriors and control vast territories. Below them are the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who own land and have rights under the law. At the bottom are the thralls, the slaves, people who have no rights, no freedom, who are property to be bought and sold. You could be born a thrall, or you could become one through debt or capture in war. It was a brutal system, but it was the system they had, and everyone understood their place within it. Family ties were everything in this world. Your family determined who you were, what opportunities you had, who would support you and who you owed support to. Feuds between families could last for generations, with each act of violence demanding revenge, creating cycles of bloodshed that could only be broken by payment of vergild, the blood price, or by the complete destruction of one family or the other. Honor was paramount. A man's reputation, his fame, was more important than his life. Better to die gloriously in battle and be remembered in song than to live a long life of shame and cowardice and be forgotten. The worst insult you could give a Viking man was to call him unmanly, to suggest that he lacked courage or strength. Such an insult could only be answered with violence, with blood. And women? Women in this society occupy a complex space. They're not powerless, far from it. A Viking woman can own property, can demand a divorce, can manage an entire farm while her husband is off raiding the coasts of England or Francia. The household is her domain, and that's no small thing. The keys she wears at her belt are symbols of her authority. She controls the stores, the servants, the very survival of her family through the long winter months. In many ways, Viking women had more freedom and more legal rights than women in other European societies of the time. In Christian Europe, women were largely under the control of their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons. They couldn't own property in their own right. They couldn't make legal agreements. They were perpetual minors in the eyes of the law, always needing a male guardian. Viking women were different. They could own land. They could inherit property. If their husbands died, they didn't automatically pass under the control of a male relative. They could manage their own affairs. They could even initiate divorce, though the process was complicated and required them to declare their intention in front of witnesses. Still, the fact that divorce was possible at all, that a woman could legally end a marriage she was unhappy with, was remarkable for the time. But there were limits. She cannot speak in the assembly, the thing where men gather to debate law and settle disputes. She cannot inherit equally with her brothers, and while she's respected, even revered in her role, that role is still defined, still bounded. She's supposed to weave and cook and bear children and manage the household. She's supposed to be strong, yes, but strong in a particular way. Strong in endurance, strong in wisdom, strong in the ability to survive and to help her family survive. Think about what it took to run a Viking household. It wasn't just a matter of cooking meals and cleaning. A woman needed to know how to manage resources, how to make sure the family had enough food stored away to last through the winter. She needed to know how to preserve food, how to make cheese and butter, how to dry fish and meat, how to store grain so it wouldn't spoil. She needed to understand animal husbandry, because the family's wealth was tied up in their livestock. Losing animals to disease or predators could mean starvation. She also needed to know how to produce cloth, which was one of the most time-consuming and important tasks in any household. Growing or acquiring wool, cleaning it, carding it, spinning it into thread, dyeing the thread if you wanted colored fabric, then weaving it into cloth. This process took months of work. A single cloak might represent hundreds of hours of labor, and clothing wasn't just about keeping warm, though that was important in the Scandinavian climate. It was about status, the quality of your clothing, the fineness of the weave, the richness of the dyes. All of these things signaled your family's wealth and standing. Beyond practical skills, a Viking woman needed to be smart, politically savvy, capable of managing relationships within the community. She needed to know who to trade with, who to trust, who might be a threat to her family. She needed to be able to navigate the complex web of alliances and obligations that held society together. In many cases, she was the one maintaining these relationships while her husband was away, which could be for months or even years at a time. And she needed to be tough. Not just physically, though physical toughness certainly helped, but mentally and emotionally tough. She needed to be able to handle loss, because loss was constant. Children died in infancy or childhood at horrifying rates. Husbands and sons died in raids or feuds or accidents. Winters brought hunger and cold and disease. A woman who couldn't handle grief and keep going wouldn't survive long in this world. So when we talk about Viking women having a certain amount of power and autonomy, we need to understand that this wasn't granted out of some enlightened sense of equality. It was practical necessity. The Viking way of life, with men frequently away on voyages that could last months or years, required women to be capable and independent. A household couldn't function, a farm couldn't survive, if the woman in charge wasn't strong and skilled and decisive. But here's the crucial thing. All of this power, all of this autonomy, was still confined within certain boundaries. A woman could manage the household, but the household was still her designated sphere. A woman could be strong, but her strength was supposed to be exercised in service of her family, not for her own glory. A woman could be independent when her husband was away, but when he returned, he was still the ultimate authority. She's not supposed to pick up a sword and go to war. Except, according to the stories, some of them did exactly that. Now, before we go any further, we need to talk about our source, because everything we know about Lagertha comes from a single text written by a single man hundreds of years after the events he describes. His name was Saxo, and he was a Danish historian who lived in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. We don't know much about him personally. He was probably a clerk or secretary to Absalon, the Archbishop of Lund, who was one of the most powerful men in Denmark at the time. Saxo was educated, literate in Latin, and ambitious. He wanted to write a history of Denmark that would rival the great histories of Rome and Greece. Let's pause for a moment and think about what Denmark was like in Saxo's time. This was about 400 years after the end of the Viking Age. The world had changed dramatically. The old pagan religions were gone, replaced by Christianity. The loose confederations of independent chieftains and jarls had been replaced by centralized kingdoms with hereditary monarchies. The age of raids and conquests was over. Denmark was now part of medieval Christendom, integrated into the political and religious structures of Europe. Saxo lived in a time of relative peace and prosperity, at least compared to the violent centuries of the Viking Age. But it was also a time of anxiety about the past. The pagan ancestors were both fascinating and troubling to medieval Christians. On one hand, they were the forebears, the people who had built the kingdoms that still existed. On the other hand, they were heathens, pagans who had worshipped false gods and committed terrible violence. How do you reconcile pride in your ancestors with condemnation of their beliefs and practices? Saxo's answer was to write a history that acknowledged both the greatness and the chaos of the pagan past. He would celebrate the courage and achievements of Denmark's legendary heroes, while also making it clear that the old ways were disordered, violent, and in need of the civilizing influence of Christianity and proper monarchy. His history would be both a source of national pride and a moral lesson about the importance of Christian order. To accomplish this, Saxo needed sources. And this is where things get complicated. For the early legendary period of Danish history, there were no written records. The Vikings didn't keep written histories. They had an oral tradition, stories passed down from generation to generation by memory, by songs, by poems recited by skalds, the professional poets who served kings and preserved the deeds of heroes. By Saxo's time, many of these oral traditions were still alive, though they'd been through 400 years of evolution and change. Saxo also had access to Icelandic sagas, written texts that had been composed in Iceland starting in the 12th century. These sagas drew on the same oral traditions, but had already been shaped and structured by their authors. Saxo used these sagas as sources, but he also felt free to modify them, to combine different stories, to add his own interpretations and embellishments. The result was the Gesta Danorum, which translates to the deeds of the Danes. It's a massive work, 16 books in total, chronicling the history of Denmark from its mythical origins all the way up to Saxo's own time. The first 9 books, where Lagertha appears, are a wild mix of legend, saga, and outright fantasy. Gods walk the earth, heroes fight dragons, women turn into warriors, kings perform impossible feats. It's history, yes, but it's history filtered through the lens of medieval storytelling, with all the embellishments and exaggerations that implies. Saxo's writing style is distinctive and frankly challenging. He wrote in Latin, which was the language of learning and scholarship in medieval Europe. But his Latin isn't simple or straightforward. He was influenced by Roman authors like Valerius Maximus, whose writing style was ornate, complex, and full of rhetorical flourishes. Saxo loved elaborate sentence structures, obscure vocabulary, and moral digressions. He was showing off his education, demonstrating that he could write in the high style of classical Latin literature. This makes the Gesta Danorum difficult to read, even for people who know Latin well. The sentences twist and turn, subordinate clauses piling up on each other. The vocabulary includes rare and archaic words that would have required readers to consult dictionaries. It's the kind of writing that announces itself as important and learned, capital I, capital L. Saxo wanted his readers to know that this wasn't some simple chronicle. This was literature. But underneath all the rhetorical ornamentation, Saxo was also a good storyteller. He knew how to structure a narrative, how to build tension, how to create memorable characters. And despite his Christian moralizing and his disapproval of pagan disorder, he clearly found the old stories compelling. He includes them with relish, giving us vivid details of battles and feuds and love affairs and betrayals. Saxo was writing for a Christian audience in a Christian age. The Viking world he describes was pagan, and he views it with a mixture of fascination and moral disapproval. To him, the old pagan Denmark was a place of chaos and disorder, a world that needed the civilizing influence of the church and a strong monarchy to set it right. And women warriors, they're part of that chaos. They're unnatural, aberrations, examples of what happens when society doesn't have proper order. But here's the thing. Even though Saxo disapproves, even though he's writing with a specific agenda, he still includes these women in his history. He still tells their stories. And he tells them with a certain grudging admiration, a recognition that these women, whether they were real or not, represented something powerful and worth remembering. The Gesta Danorum was completed sometime around 1208 to 1216, though the exact date is uncertain. Saxo dedicated the work to Archbishop Absalon, though Absalon died in 1201 before the work was finished. This has led scholars to think that Saxo actually revised and expanded the text after Absalon's death, perhaps changing his focus or adding new material. The text itself almost disappeared. During Saxo's lifetime and for a few centuries after, only a few manuscript copies existed, and they were scattered in monasteries and libraries. By the early 16th century, the Gesta Danorum was almost lost. But then a Danish scholar named Christian Pedersen went searching for it. He traveled throughout Denmark, looking for any surviving copy. Finally, he found one in the library of the Archbishop of Lund. He borrowed it, took it to Paris, and in 1514 he published the first printed edition. That printed edition saved the Gesta Danorum from oblivion. Suddenly, the text was available to scholars throughout Europe. It became a source for anyone interested in Scandinavian history, in the Viking Age, in Norse mythology. And embedded in its pages, among the tales of gods and kings and heroes, was the story of Lagertha. So when Saxo writes about Lagertha, he's not writing a straightforward historical account. He's writing a story that serves multiple purposes. It's entertainment. It's a moral lesson. It's a way of making sense of the pagan past. And maybe, just maybe, there's a kernel of truth somewhere in there, a memory of real women who defied expectations and took up arms. We'll never know for sure. But let's see what Saxo has to say. Lagertha's story begins with violence and humiliation. According to Saxo, there was once a king of Sweden named Fru. We don't know much about this Fru, whether he was a real historical figure or a composite of several raiders and warlords. But in Saxo's telling, Fru was ambitious and brutal, and he had his eyes on Norway. So he invaded. He gathered his forces, crossed the border, and fell upon the Norwegian king whose name was Sigurd. The battle was fierce, but Fru was victorious. King Sigurd was killed, his armies scattered, his kingdom conquered. But Fru didn't stop there. Killing the king wasn't enough. He wanted to humiliate the entire royal family, to grind their faces into the dirt, to make sure everyone knew that Norway belonged to him now. So he took the women of the royal household, the noblewomen, the princesses, the daughters and wives and sisters of the men who had ruled Norway, and he put them in a brothel. He forced them into sexual slavery, publicly, deliberately, as a way of demonstrating his total dominance. It was the ultimate insult, the ultimate degradation. In a society where honor meant everything, where a woman's reputation was tied to her family's reputation, this was a wound that went deeper than any sword thrust. And among those women was a young woman named Lagertha. Now, Saxo doesn't tell us much about Lagertha's background. We don't know if she was a princess herself or a lady-in-waiting or something else entirely. We don't know her age, though we can assume she was young. We don't know what she looked like, beyond Saxo's descriptions of her as having a matchless spirit, though a delicate frame, which could mean almost anything. What we do know is that she refused to accept her fate. Somehow, whether through cunning or courage or sheer stubborn will, Lagertha escaped the brothel. And not just escaped. She armed herself. She dressed in men's clothing. And she began to fight back. She wasn't alone. Other women followed her lead. They disguised themselves as male warriors, took up whatever weapons they could find, and joined the resistance against Fru. They became, in effect, a guerrilla army of women, fighting for their honor, their freedom, and their revenge. And then word reached Denmark. Word reached Ragnar Lothbrok. Ragnar. Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar Hairy Breeches, Ragnar the legendary Viking king who may or may not have actually existed, but whose name has echoed through history regardless. If you've heard of Ragnar, it's probably because of the sagas, those Icelandic stories that were written down in the 13th century, a few hundred years after the events they describe. Or maybe you've seen the television show Vikings, where Ragnar is portrayed as a charismatic, ambitious farmer who dreams of sailing west to England and who eventually becomes a king. But Ragnar's legend is more complicated than any single portrayal. He appears in multiple sources, each one telling a slightly different version of his story. There's the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, an Icelandic saga from the 13th century that tells of his marriages, his sons, his death in a pit of snakes. There's the tale of Ragnar's sons, which focuses on his famous offspring and their quest to avenge his death. There's Saxo's Gesta Danorum, which gives yet another version of his life. And there are references to a Viking chieftain named Reginhirus in Frankish chronicles from the 9th century, who led the siege of Paris in 845. Are all of these sources talking about the same person? Probably not. Most historians now think that Ragnar Lothbrok, as he appears in the sagas, is a composite figure, an amalgamation of several different historical Vikings whose stories got blended together over centuries of oral tradition. There probably were real historical figures behind the legend, perhaps a Danish king, perhaps a successful raider named Reginhirus, perhaps others whose names are lost to us. But the Ragnar of legend, the Ragnar who killed a dragon, who married 3 times, who fathered famous sons, who died dramatically in a snake pit, that Ragnar is probably more fiction than fact. And yet for our purposes it almost doesn't matter. Because the Ragnar who appears in Saxo's account of Lagertha is the legendary Ragnar, the mythical figure. Whether he was real or not is secondary to his role in Lagertha's story. He's the famous hero, the warrior king, the man whose legend eclipsed everyone around him, except, according to Saxo, not quite everyone. In Saxo's version, Ragnar is the grandson of the murdered King Sigurd. So when he hears about the invasion, about the death of his grandfather and the humiliation of the royal women, he's filled with rage and a burning desire for vengeance. He gathers an army, he calls for warriors to join him. He prepares to sail to Norway and make Fru pay for what he's done. The name Lothbrok or Lodbrok itself is fascinating. It means hairy breeches or shaggy pants in Old Norse. According to legend, Ragnar earned this nickname because of how he defeated a dragon or giant serpent that was guarding his future wife, Thora. He fashioned special trousers made of animal hide, which he boiled in tar and rolled in sand, creating a kind of armor that protected him from the creature's venom or flames. After that feat, the nickname stuck. It's the kind of detail that tells you we're firmly in the realm of legend here. Real people don't get nicknamed after their pants, especially not pants they wore to fight a dragon. But it's also the kind of detail that makes these stories memorable, that gives them color and personality and makes them feel alive even when they're clearly not realistic. Ragnar's character in the sagas is complex. He's brave, certainly, and cunning and ambitious, but he's also prideful, impulsive, sometimes cruel. He's not a perfect hero. He makes mistakes. He's driven by ego as much as by any higher purpose. He wants glory, wants to be remembered, wants to prove himself the greatest of all Vikings, and that ambition leads him into conflict, into adventure, into situations where he needs help. And that's where Lagertha enters his life. According to Saxo, when Ragnar arrived in Norway with his forces, he found that he wasn't alone in wanting to fight Fru. A group of warriors had already assembled, ready to join his cause, and at the head of this group were the women who had escaped from Fru's brothel. They were dressed as men, armed like men, ready to fight like men, and leading them all was Lagertha. Saxo describes the moment with a kind of breathless wonder. Here's what he says, and I'm paraphrasing from the Latin: Lagertha, a skilled Amazon, who, though a maiden, had the courage of a man, and fought in front among the bravest, with her hair loose over her shoulders. All marveled at her matchless deeds, for her locks flying down her back betrayed that she was a woman. There's a lot to unpack in that description. First, the reference to Amazons. Saxo is drawing on classical mythology here, on the Greek legends of warrior women from the East who rode horses and shot arrows and refused to live under the rule of men. The Amazons were a powerful image in medieval Europe, a symbol of female strength but also of inversion, of the natural order turned upside down. By calling Lagertha an Amazon, Saxo is signaling to his readers that this is something extraordinary, something outside the normal bounds of society. Second, the detail about her hair. In Viking culture, hair was significant. Women typically wore their hair long and kept it bound or covered, especially married women. To have her hair loose over her shoulders and flying down her back is a statement. It's wild, it's untamed, it's a rejection of the constraints that society places on women, but it also betrays her gender. Even disguised in men's clothing, even fighting at the front of the battle, her hair gives her away. She's a woman and everyone knows it, and yet she fights anyway, and she fights brilliantly. The battle against Fru is fierce. Saxo doesn't give us all the details, but he makes it clear that Lagertha is not just present, not just participating, but actively leading. She's at the front of the charge. She's cutting down enemies. She's inspiring the warriors around her. And according to Saxo, Ragnar himself later declares that he gained the victory by the might of one woman. One woman, not an army, not a host of warriors. One woman whose courage and skill turned the tide. And Ragnar, it seems, is impressed. Now you might think that after a battle like that, after witnessing Lagertha's courage firsthand, Ragnar would approach her with respect, with admiration, maybe even as an equal. And in a way he does. But this is the 9th century, and this is a Viking saga, so nothing is ever simple. Ragnar doesn't just want to thank Lagertha or make her an ally. He wants to marry her. He's smitten. He's fascinated. He's probably a little bit intimidated, if we're being honest, and attracted to her precisely because she's so different from what he expects a woman to be. But Lagertha isn't interested. Or rather, she's interested in making sure that Ragnar earns her. She's not going to be won over by pretty words or grand gestures. If Ragnar wants her hand, he's going to have to prove himself. And so, according to Saxo, she sets a test. Lagertha returns to her home in the Gaula Valley, a region in western Norway, and she places guards at her door. Not human guards. She posts a bear and a hound, a literal bear, and a giant, ferocious dog. They're her pets, her protectors, her test. If Ragnar wants to court her, he'll have to get past them first. Now let's pause for a moment and appreciate how absolutely insane this is. Lagertha, a woman who has just fought in a major battle, who has led warriors and killed enemies and earned the respect of one of the most famous Viking heroes of legend, decides that the best way to vet a suitor is to set wild animals on him. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. It's darkly funny. It's exactly the kind of thing that makes these sagas so memorable. And Ragnar, to his credit, accepts the challenge. He travels to the Gaula Valley. He brings his companions with him, but he tells them to wait outside. This is something he has to do alone, and then he approaches Lagertha's home, and the bear and the hound come charging at him. What follows is the stuff of legend. Ragnar kills the bear with his spear, driving the weapon deep into the animal's chest. Then he turns to the hound, and with his bare hands, he chokes it to death. Saxo doesn't spare any details. This is brutal, visceral, a fight for survival against creatures that could easily rip a man apart. But Ragnar prevails. He stands there, covered in blood, victorious over the guardians Lagertha has set against him. And that, apparently, is enough. Lagertha accepts his suit. They marry. But here's the thing. Even though Lagertha agrees to marry Ragnar, even though they become husband and wife, there's a sense throughout Saxo's account that the power dynamic is never quite what you'd expect. Lagertha isn't a passive bride. She isn't grateful or demure. She's chosen Ragnar, yes, but on her own terms. And Saxo hints that Ragnar, for all his strength and cunning, is never entirely comfortable with this. He's won her hand, but he knows that he's married a woman who is, in many ways, his equal, maybe even his better. According to Saxo, the marriage produces 3 children, 2 daughters whose names are never recorded, and a son named Fridleif. For a few years they lived together, presumably in Norway. It's possible they were happy. It's possible they were a powerful couple, ruling together, fighting together, building a life together. Or it's possible the marriage was always uneasy, always complicated by the fact that Lagertha was not the kind of wife Ragnar might have expected. Whatever the case, it doesn't last. After about 3 years, Ragnar is called back to Denmark. There's a civil war brewing, a challenge to his rule, and he has to leave Norway to deal with it. And it's at this point that the marriage falls apart. Saxo offers an interesting explanation for why Ragnar divorces Lagertha. He says that Ragnar was still annoyed that Lagertha had set the bear and the hound on him during their courtship. Even years later, even after marriage and children, he apparently held a grudge. It's a petty reason, almost comically so. This great hero, this legendary king, is bothered by the fact that his wife tested him before agreeing to marry him. It's the kind of detail that makes you wonder if Saxo is being tongue-in-cheek, if he's subtly mocking Ragnar's pride. But there's probably more to it than that. Ragnar is ambitious. He's building an empire, making alliances, consolidating power. And marriage, in the Viking world, is as much a political tool as it is a personal relationship. So when Ragnar hears about a Swedish king named Harold, and hears that this king has a beautiful daughter named Thora, and hears that there's a giant serpent or dragon or lindworm, depending on which version you read, guarding Thora, and that any man who defeats the creature can win her hand, well, that's an opportunity. That's a chance to forge an alliance with Sweden, to expand his influence, to add to his legend. So Ragnar sets out to defeat the lindworm. He fashions special clothing for himself, trousers made of animal hide, boiled in pitch and covered with sand and ice, to protect himself from the creature's venom or flames. He fights the monster and wins. He claims Thora's hand. And in doing so, he casts Lagertha aside. It's worth noting that Saxo doesn't portray Ragnar in a particularly sympathetic light here. He's choosing political advantage over personal loyalty. He's discarding a wife who has fought beside him, who has borne his children, who has proven herself time and again. And for what? For a princess and a better alliance. It's pragmatic, maybe even smart from a strategic standpoint, but it's also cold. As for Lagertha, Saxo doesn't tell us how she reacts to the divorce. We don't get her perspective, her feelings, her thoughts. All we know is that she returns to Norway, and then, for a time, she disappears from the narrative. Ragnar goes on with his life, marries Thora, has more children, continues his adventures, and Lagertha fades into the background. But she's not gone. Not by a long shot. Years pass. Ragnar's life, as you might expect, is full of drama and conflict. His marriage to Thora ends, though we're not told exactly how. In some versions of the saga, she dies. In others, he divorces her too. Eventually, he marries again, this time to a woman named Aslaug, who claims to be the daughter of the legendary hero Sigurd and the Valkyrie Brynhild. They have children together, including famous sons like Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. names that will become famous in their own right. But ruling a kingdom is never easy, and Ragnar finds himself facing another civil war in Denmark. His enemies are rising against him. His forces are outnumbered. He's in real danger of losing everything he's built. And so, in desperation, he sends word to his allies calling for aid. And one of the people who answers the call is Lagertha. By this point, Lagertha is no longer just a warrior. She's remarried and her new husband is the king of Norway. That means she's a queen in her own right, or at least co-ruler of a kingdom. She has resources, ships, warriors at her command. And when she hears that Ragnar is in trouble, she doesn't hesitate. According to Saxo, she assembles a fleet of 120 ships and sails to Denmark to join the fight. 120 ships. That's a massive force. It's more than most jarls could muster. It's a statement of power, of wealth, of influence. Lagertha has not just survived since the divorce. She's thrived. She's become one of the most powerful figures in the north. And she's coming to Ragnar's aid, not out of obligation, not because she owes him anything, but perhaps out of lingering loyalty, or perhaps because she sees an opportunity, or perhaps simply because she's still, at her core, a warrior. And this is what warriors do, is what? The battle is fierce. Saxo describes it in vivid terms. Ragnar's forces are struggling. At one point, his son Sigurd, presumably a son from his marriage to Thora or Aslaug, is wounded and in danger of being killed. The battle is on the verge of turning into a rout, a complete disaster for Ragnar. And then Lagertha makes her move. She doesn't just fight. She leads a tactical maneuver that changes the entire course of the battle. Saxo writes that she made a sally about and flew round to the rear of the enemy, taking them unawares, and thus turned the panic of her friends into the camp of the enemy. In other words, she executed a flanking maneuver. She circled around behind the enemy forces, attacked them from the rear, created chaos and confusion, and turned what was about to be a defeat into a victory. It's the kind of tactical brilliance that you'd expect from an experienced commander, someone who understands warfare not just as a matter of individual courage, but as a strategic undertaking. Lagertha saves the day. She saves Ragnar's life, his kingdom, his legacy. And Saxo makes sure to emphasize that it was Lagertha's leadership, Lagertha's skill, Lagertha's courage that made the difference. Once again, Ragnar owes his victory to a woman. You have to wonder what that must have felt like for Ragnar, to be saved by the wife he cast aside, to owe his kingdom, maybe his life, to the woman he divorced in favor of political advantage. There's a kind of poetic justice in it, a sense that Lagertha has proven once and for all that she was never the one who needed him. If anything, he's always needed her. But the story doesn't end with reconciliation or gratitude or a renewed partnership. Instead, it takes a darker turn. After the battle, Lagertha returns to Norway. She goes back to her husband, the king, and to her life as a queen. And that, you might think, would be the end of her story in Saxo's account. She's had her moment of glory. She's proven herself. She can fade back into the background now. But no. There's one more act to Lagertha's story. One more moment of violence and ambition and ruthless determination. According to Saxo, when Lagertha returns to Norway, she and her husband have a quarrel. We don't know what it was about. Maybe it was about the fact that she just sailed off to Denmark with a massive fleet to help her ex-husband. Maybe it was about power, about who really ruled Norway. Maybe it was personal, private, something that had been building for years. Saxo doesn't give us the details. All he tells us is that they argued, and Lagertha decided that she'd had enough. So she killed him. Saxo's description is chillingly matter-of-fact. Lagertha concealed a spear point in her dress, a small weapon hidden in the folds of fabric. And in the middle of their argument, or perhaps afterward, when his guard was down, she pulled out the spear and stabbed him. The king of Norway killed by his own wife in his own home, with a weapon he never saw coming. And then, having murdered her husband, Lagertha claimed his throne for herself. She didn't flee. She didn't try to justify or excuse what she'd done. She simply took power. She became the sole ruler of Norway, answering to no one, sharing her authority with no one. Saxo even includes a quote that's become one of the most famous lines associated with Lagertha. He says she thought it pleasanter to rule without her husband than to share the throne with him. It's a stunning moment. It's cold-blooded. It's ruthless. It's exactly the kind of ambition that, if a man had displayed it, might have been celebrated as strength and decisive leadership. But because it's a woman, because it's Lagertha, Saxo seems both fascinated and horrified. He's giving us a glimpse of a woman who is utterly uncompromising in her pursuit of power. She's not content to be a consort, a partner, a co-ruler. She wants to rule alone, and she's willing to kill to make that happen. Now we have to be careful here. Saxo is writing from a Christian medieval perspective, and he has very specific ideas about how women should behave. A woman who murders her husband and seizes power is, to him, an example of chaos, of the natural order overturned. He's not celebrating Lagertha. He's using her as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when women step too far outside their prescribed roles. But even as he's disapproving, even as he's framing this as a negative example, he's still telling the story. And the story he's telling is of a woman who is powerful, capable, and utterly unwilling to be constrained by anyone or anything. And then, after that moment of triumph, after Lagertha has killed her husband and claimed the throne of Norway for herself, she vanishes from the pages of Saxo's history. There's no more mention of her, no description of her reign as queen, no account of how she ruled or what she did, or how long she held power or how her story ended. She simply disappears, as if the act of seizing power was the climax of her story, and everything after that was unimportant or unknown. It's a frustrating place to leave things. We want to know more. We want to know how Lagertha ruled, whether she was a good queen, whether she faced challenges, whether she was eventually overthrown, or whether she died peacefully in her sleep decades later. But Saxo doesn't tell us, and no other historical source mentions her. She's there and then she's gone, leaving us with questions and a lingering sense of awe at what she accomplished. So was Lagertha real? It's the question that everyone wants answered, and unfortunately it's the question that's almost impossible to answer definitively. Let's look at the evidence, or lack thereof. First, the only historical source that mentions Lagertha by name is Saxo's Gesta Danorum. That's it. No other medieval chronicler, no other saga, no runestone, no archaeological find has ever turned up her name. If she was as prominent as Saxo suggests, if she really was a queen of Norway, you'd expect there to be other references to her, other traces of her existence, but there aren't any. Second, Saxo was writing hundreds of years after the events he describes. The Viking Age, broadly speaking, lasted from roughly the late 8th century to the mid-11th century. Saxo was writing in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. That means there's a gap of several hundred years between the time Lagertha supposedly lived and the time Saxo wrote about her. And in those centuries, her story would have been passed down orally, changing and evolving with each retelling, accumulating embellishments and distortions and outright inventions. By the time Saxo got hold of it, who knows how much of the original truth, if there was any, remained. Third, Saxo himself admits that much of what he includes in the first 9 books of the Gesta Danorum is drawn from legend and saga. He's not trying to write a dry, factual account. He's trying to create a sweeping, dramatic history that will entertain and edify his readers. And he's willing to blur the line between history and mythology to do it. So if we're being honest, the most likely scenario is that Lagertha, as Saxo describes her, is not a straightforward historical figure. She's probably a composite, a blending of different stories, different women, different legends, all woven together into a single character. Maybe there was a real woman or several real women who fought in battles during the Viking Age, and their stories got passed down and eventually coalesced into the legend of Lagertha. Or maybe she's entirely fictional, a character invented by saga tellers to explore ideas about gender, power, and courage. But here's the thing. Even if Lagertha wasn't real, the fact that her story exists tells us something important. It tells us that the idea of a woman warrior, a shield-maiden, was part of the cultural imagination of the Viking world and the medieval North. It tells us that people told stories about women who fought, who led, who refused to accept the limitations placed on them by society. And those stories mattered. They resonated. They were compelling enough to be remembered and retold for centuries. And in recent years, archaeology has started to suggest that maybe, just maybe, there's more truth to these stories than we thought. Before we delve deeper into the archaeological findings about Viking women warriors, we need to understand just how difficult it is to find evidence for anything about the Viking Age. This is a period that left relatively few written records, at least compared to other medieval civilizations. The Vikings themselves didn't write much down. They had runes, yes, which they carved on stones and wood and metal, but these runic inscriptions were typically short, commemorative rather than narrative. They'd mark a grave or commemorate a deed or record ownership of property, but they didn't tell detailed stories. Most of what we know about the Viking Age comes from three types of sources, and each one has serious limitations. First, there are the later sagas written in Iceland 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. These are wonderful literary works, full of drama and character and vivid storytelling, but they're not history in the modern sense. They're historical fiction at best, blending genuine traditions and memories with later inventions, moral lessons, and pure entertainment. They tell us a lot about how 13th century Icelanders thought about their past, but whether they accurately reflect 9th century reality is another question entirely. Second, there are foreign sources, chronicles and annals written by people outside the Viking world. We have accounts from Anglo-Saxon England, from Frankish monasteries, from Byzantine historians, from Arab travelers. These sources are valuable because they're contemporary or near contemporary, written by people who actually encountered Vikings. But they're also problematic. They're written by enemies or outsiders who often didn't understand Viking culture and had their own agendas. Christian monks writing about Viking raids were hardly neutral observers. They saw the Vikings as pagan barbarians, violent heathens who destroyed churches and killed innocents. Their accounts are colored by fear, hatred, and religious prejudice. Third, and most importantly for our purposes, there's archaeology. Physical evidence, graves, settlements, artifacts, the actual material remains of Viking Age society. Archaeology doesn't lie in the same way that texts can, but it still requires interpretation, and interpretation is always shaped by the assumptions and biases of the people doing the interpreting. For a long time, archaeologists made a crucial assumption about Viking graves. If a grave contained weapons, the person buried there must be male. It seems logical, right? Warriors are men. Weapons are for warriors. Therefore, weapons equal male burial. This assumption was so deeply ingrained that for over a century, archaeologists didn't even bother to examine skeletal remains from weapon graves to determine the biological sex of the person buried there. They just assumed. This assumption shaped everything. It shaped how sites were excavated, how findings were catalogued, how burial practices were understood. It created a self-reinforcing cycle. We assume warriors are male, therefore we categorize weapon burials as male. Therefore we see evidence that warriors are male, which confirms our assumption, and so on. But what if the assumption was wrong? What if at least some of those weapon burials, the ones that were automatically labeled as male warriors, actually contained women? This isn't just a hypothetical question. In recent decades, advances in skeletal analysis, and especially in DNA testing, have made it possible to determine biological sex with much greater certainty than visual examination of bones alone. And when researchers have gone back and tested some of these assumed male weapon burials, they've gotten some surprising results. Not all of them, to be clear. The vast majority of weapon burials do turn out to contain biological males, which makes sense given what we know about Viking society. But there are exceptions. There are graves where the weapons and warrior paraphernalia are accompanied by female skeletal remains. And each one of these exceptions forces us to reconsider our assumptions. It's also worth noting what we mean by weapons in a burial context. We're not just talking about swords, though those are certainly present. We're talking about axes, which could be tools as well as weapons. We're talking about spears. We're talking about arrows and bows. We're talking about shields. We're talking about items like whetstones for sharpening blades, or the special gaming pieces that some scholars believe were used for tactical planning and might indicate military leadership. Some archaeologists argue that even when weapons appear in female burials, they might be symbolic rather than functional. Perhaps the woman wasn't a warrior herself, but was from a warrior family. Perhaps the weapons were placed there to honor her family's martial tradition. Perhaps they represented her status or wealth, rather than her personal occupation. These are fair points. We can't just assume that every woman buried with weapons was necessarily a warrior in life. Burial practices are symbolic, ritualistic. They don't always reflect the deceased person's actual occupation or activities. But here's the counter-argument. We don't apply this skepticism to male weapon burials. When we find a man buried with a sword and a shield and a horse, we don't say, well, maybe he wasn't really a warrior. Maybe the weapons were just symbolic of his family's status. We assume he was a warrior because he was buried like one. So why do we apply different standards to women? Why are we so much more skeptical when the bones turn out to be female? This double standard reveals our biases. We're comfortable with the idea of male warriors because that fits our expectations, our mental model of what Viking society was like. But female warriors make us uncomfortable, make us question our assumptions, and so we look for alternative explanations, ways to explain away the evidence without having to change our fundamental understanding. The truth is probably complicated. Most Viking warriors were probably male. Warfare was primarily a male activity, and the archaeological record supports this. But primarily doesn't mean exclusively. There's growing evidence that at least some women, in at least some circumstances, took on warrior roles. Whether this was common or rare, accepted or exceptional, honored or transgressive, those are questions we're still trying to answer. What we can say is that the idea of women warriors was part of Viking culture. It existed in their stories, their myths, their legends, and increasingly archaeology is suggesting that it existed in reality too, at least sometimes. In 1889, Swedish archaeologists excavated a burial site in Birka, a Viking Age trading town located on an island west of Stockholm. The grave, catalogued as BJ 581, was elaborate. It contained a full set of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, a knife, armor-piercing arrows, a shield. There were also 2 horses, sacrificed and buried alongside the human remains, and a set of gaming pieces, the kind used to play strategic war games. Everything about the burial screamed high-status warrior, possibly even a military commander, someone who planned battles and led troops. For over a century, everyone assumed the person buried there was a man, because of course it was a man. Vikings' warriors were men. That was the assumption. The weapons, the horses, the strategic game pieces, all of it fit the profile of a male warrior. Gender wasn't even tested. It was just taken for granted. But in 2017, a team of researchers led by Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson from Stockholm University decided to take a closer look. They used modern DNA analysis to determine the biological sex of the skeleton. And what they found was shocking to many in the archaeological community. The Birka warrior was female. The announcement sparked immediate and intense debate. Some scholars celebrated the finding as proof that Viking shield maidens were real, that women did fight in the Viking Age, that the sagas and legends weren't just fantasies. Others were skeptical. They questioned the DNA results, even though they'd been confirmed multiple times. They suggested alternative explanations. Maybe the woman was buried with weapons for symbolic reasons. Maybe she was a ritualist or a priestess, rather than an actual warrior. Maybe the grave goods didn't reflect her actual role in life. The debate continues to this day. But what's clear is that the Birka grave has fundamentally changed the conversation. It's forced archaeologists and historians to reconsider their assumptions about gender roles in the Viking Age. It's opened up the possibility that the literary accounts of shield maidens, which were often dismissed as pure fiction, might have had some basis in reality after all. And the Birka grave isn't the only one. There are other female burials from the Viking Age that contain weapons. A grave in Norway, sometimes called Erika the Red, contained a woman buried with a sword, an axe, a shield, arrows, and a horse. Another burial in Denmark revealed similar findings. None of these graves are as elaborate or as clearly warrior-focused as the Birka burial, and in each case there's debate about interpretation. But taken together, they suggest a picture that's more complex than the simple men fought, women stayed home narrative that dominated for so long. It's possible, even likely, that most Viking women did not fight. That warfare was still predominantly a male activity, that the vast majority of women lived out their lives managing farms and raising children, and never picked up a weapon in their lives. But it's also increasingly clear that some women did fight. Some women trained with weapons. Some women, whether out of necessity or choice or exceptional circumstance, became warriors. And those women, rare as they may have been, were real. So when we look at Lagertha's story, we have to ask, could she have been one of those women? Could there have been a real person behind the legend, a Norwegian woman in the 9th century who fought in battles and married Ragnar Lothbrok and eventually ruled as a queen? Maybe. It's possible. But if she was real, her story was certainly embellished and mythologized by the time it reached Saxo Grammaticus. The bear and the hound, the dramatic battlefield maneuvers, the murder of her husband, those elements feel more like literary invention than historical fact. But the core idea, a woman who was a warrior, who defied expectations, who carved out her own path, that could be rooted in reality. Or maybe not. Maybe Lagertha is entirely a creation of storytellers and saga tellers. And you know what? That's okay too. Because even if she never existed, her story still matters. There's another theory about Lagertha, one that takes us in a different direction entirely. Some scholars, including the historian Hilda Roderick Ellis-Davidson and Nora Chadwick, have suggested that Lagertha isn't based on a historical woman at all. Instead, they argue, she's a reflection of a Norse goddess named Thorgerd, or in Old Norse, Thorgerda Helgabruder. Thorgerd is a somewhat obscure deity in the Norse pantheon. She doesn't appear in the main mythological texts like the Poetic Edda or the Prose Edda, at least not prominently. But she does show up in some sagas, particularly those connected to the region of Halagaland in northern Norway. Thorgerd was apparently a local goddess, worshipped by the people of that area, and she was especially associated with Hakon Sigurdsson, a powerful jarl who lived in the late 10th century. According to the sagas, Hakon worshipped Thorgerd and credited her with his military successes. In some versions, she's described as his protectress, a divine figure who appears to him in battle and helps him defeat his enemies. In other versions, she's said to be his wife, though whether that's a literal marriage or a metaphorical one is unclear. The sagas describe Thorgerd and her sister Irpa appearing during a battle, with their hair flying loose, shooting arrows from their fingertips, and causing the enemy forces to panic and flee. Now there are some striking parallels between Thorgerd and Lagertha. Both are associated with the region of western Norway. Lagertha, according to Saxo, lived in the Gaular Valley, which is close to the area where Thorgerd was worshipped. Both are described as fierce warriors with hair flying loose. Both come to the aid of a male leader in battle, turning the tide with their intervention. Both are connected in different ways to Hakon Sigurdsson, though the timeline doesn't quite match up, since Hakon lived in the 10th century, and Lagertha supposedly lived in the 9th. The theory then is that when Saxo was collecting stories for his Gesta Danorum, he came across tales about Thorgerd, this fierce goddess figure, and he historicized her. He turned her into a human woman, Lagertha, and placed her in the context of Ragnar Lothbrok's saga. It's the same process that happens with a lot of mythology. Divine figures get humanized, their stories get attached to historical figures, and over time, the line between god and hero blurs. It's a compelling theory. It would explain why Lagertha doesn't appear in any other sources, why her story has such mythological elements, why she seems almost too perfect, too emblematic to be a real historical person. If she's based on a goddess, then of course she's extraordinary, of course she's larger than life, that's the point. But it's also just a theory. We can't prove it. We don't have enough information about Thorgerd to know for sure how her worship evolved or how her stories spread. And even if Lagertha is based on Thorgerd, that doesn't mean there was no historical woman involved. It's possible that a real woman warrior inspired both the goddess cult and the legend of Lagertha, or it's possible that the goddess inspired the legend, which then got attached to a historical figure, creating a feedback loop of myth and history. The truth, as frustrating as it is to admit, is that we'll probably never know for certain. Lagertha exists in that grey area between history and mythology, where the evidence is ambiguous and the interpretations are endless. She could be a real woman, a goddess, a composite, a complete fiction, or some combination of all of those. And maybe that ambiguity is part of what makes her story so enduring. She's a mystery, an enigma, a figure we can never quite pin down. And perhaps that's fitting for a woman who, according to legend, refused to be pinned down by anyone or anything in her life. Whether or not Lagertha herself was real, she's part of a larger tradition in Norse literature, the shield-maiden. The term comes from the Old Norse skjaldmær, literally shield-maiden, and it refers to women who took up arms and fought as warriors. They appear throughout the sagas, these legendary texts that blend history, mythology, and heroic storytelling. One of the most famous shield maidens in Norse literature is Hervor, the protagonist of the saga of Hervor and Heidrek. Hervor is raised as a girl, but from a young age she's drawn to masculine pursuits. She doesn't want to weave or spin or learn domestic skills. She wants to learn archery and swordplay. She wants to sail and fight and adventure. Eventually she dresses as a man, takes on a male name, and becomes a Viking raider, sailing the seas and plundering just like the male warriors around her. Later in her life she seeks out her father's grave to claim his legendary sword, Tyrfing, which is cursed but incredibly powerful. She raises her family, eventually settling down, but her legacy lives on through her descendants. Then there's Brynhildr, one of the central figures in the Volsunga saga. Brynhildr is a Valkyrie, one of Odin's warrior maidens who decide who lives and who dies in battle. But she defies Odin, and as punishment, he strips her of her immortality and places her in an enchanted sleep, surrounded by a ring of fire. Only a hero brave enough to ride through the flames can wake her and claim her hand. That hero turns out to be Sigurd, and their tragic love story becomes one of the most famous in all of Norse mythology. Brynhildr is fierce, proud, and utterly uncompromising. When she feels betrayed, she orchestrates Sigurd's murder and then kills herself rather than live without him. She's a figure of passionate intensity, a woman who refuses to be diminished or controlled. There are others. Saxo himself mentions several shield maidens in different parts of the Gesta Danorum. There's Rusla, who leads a rebellion. There's Sela, who fights in disguise. There's an entire section where Saxo describes a battle in which 300 shield maidens fight alongside male warriors. The Battle of Bravery, it's called, and while most historians consider it largely legendary, the fact that Saxo includes so many female warriors in his account tells us something about the cultural imagination of the time. These women, whether they were real or not, represented something important. They were liminal figures existing on the boundary between male and female, between human and divine, between order and chaos. They challenged the norms of their society. They took on roles that were supposed to be reserved for men, and in doing so, they became symbols of courage, independence, and the refusal to be constrained. But here's the key question. Did real shield maidens exist in the Viking Age? Not the legendary figures from the sagas, but actual historical women who fought as warriors? The honest answer is that we don't know for sure. The archaeological evidence is limited and contested, as we saw with the Birka grave. The written sources are all from later periods, filtered through layers of interpretation and embellishment. There are hints, suggestions, possibilities, but no definitive proof. What we do know is that Viking women had more freedom and power than women in many other medieval societies. They could own property, manage estates, demand divorces, and wield considerable influence within their communities. They were respected, valued, and in some cases feared. The sagas are full of strong women who shape events, who make decisions, who take revenge, who refuse to be passive. And in a society like that, in a culture that valued courage and martial prowess above almost everything else, it's not hard to imagine that some women might have taken up weapons. Whether they did so regularly, whether they fought in large-scale battles, whether they formed organized units of female warriors, those are different questions, and the answers are probably no, at least not commonly. But could individual women, in specific circumstances, have become warriors? Could a woman who was skilled and brave and determined have carved out a place for herself in the male-dominated world of Viking warfare? Based on what we're learning from archaeology, based on the stories that were told and retold, the answer seems to be yes. It was possible, it was rare maybe, but possible. And Lagertha, whether she was real or legendary or some combination of both, represents that possibility. She's the embodiment of the shield maiden ideal, a woman who refuses to accept the limitations placed on her, who fights and leads and rules, who is every bit as capable as the men around her, and in some ways more capable. She's a dream, maybe, or a fantasy, but she's also a challenge. She dares us to imagine a world where women are not confined to prescribed roles, where courage and strength are not gendered virtues, where anyone, regardless of their sex, can become a hero. Before we move on, it's worth spending a bit more time on Saxo Grammaticus himself, because his treatment of Lagertha and other shield maidens is deeply ambivalent. On one hand, he clearly finds these women fascinating. He devotes significant space to their stories. He describes their exploits in vivid detail. He gives them agency, intelligence, and power. They're not passive figures or props in male heroes' stories. They're active participants, sometimes even the main characters. On the other hand, Saxo is a Christian writing in a Christian age, and he has very specific ideas about proper social order. To him, the pagan past of Denmark was a time of chaos, and one of the signs of that chaos was women stepping outside their natural roles. In his view, women are supposed to be wives and mothers, managing households, supporting their husbands, bearing children. When they become warriors, when they take on male roles, it's a perversion of the natural order. It's something that needs to be corrected, civilized, brought under control by the church and a stable monarchy. So when Saxo writes about Lagertha killing her husband and seizing power, he's not celebrating her ambition. He's using her as an example of what happens in a disordered society. Look, he seems to be saying, look at what women do when they're not properly constrained. They murder their husbands, they seize thrones, they cause chaos. This is why we need Christianity, why we need proper social structures, why we need women to accept their place. But here's the fascinating part. Even as he's disapproving, even as he's framing these stories as cautionary tales, Saxo can't quite hide his admiration. He describes Lagertha's courage with genuine awe. He marvels at her tactical brilliance. He quotes her as saying she'd rather rule alone than share power, and while he might intend that as a criticism, it comes across as a statement of strength and independence. Saxo is torn. He's drawn to these powerful women even as he condemns them. He finds them compelling even as he tries to use them to make a moral point. This tension, this ambivalence is what makes the Gesta Danorum such a rich and complicated text. Saxo is not a straightforward misogynist. He's more nuanced than that. He recognizes female power and capability, but he's also uncomfortable with it. He wants to contain it, to explain it, to fit it into a framework that makes sense to his medieval Christian worldview. And in doing so, he preserves these stories, these images of fierce, independent, uncompromising women, even as he tries to tame them. The result is that Lagertha and the other shield maidens in the Gesta Danorum feel strangely modern. They're not paragons of medieval virtue. They're not saints or martyrs or dutiful wives. They're complicated, flawed, ambitious, dangerous. They're women who want power and who are willing to fight for it. They're women who love and betray and kill. They're women who refuse to be anyone other than themselves. And that, more than anything else, is why their stories have endured. For centuries after Saxo wrote the Gesta Danorum, Lagertha remained a relatively obscure figure. The text itself was well known among scholars, especially in Scandinavia, but Lagertha was a minor character in a sprawling work. She had her moment, her few pages of glory, and then she was largely forgotten by the wider world. That started to change in the late 18th century. In 1789, a Norwegian playwright named Kristen Pram wrote a historical drama called Lagertha. It was based on Saxo's account, and it portrayed Lagertha as a heroic figure, a symbol of Norwegian strength and independence. The play was a success, and it inspired other artists. The choreographer Vincenzo Galeotti created a ballet based on the story, with music by Klaus Scholl, and it premiered in 1801 at the Royal Danish Theatre. It was the first ballet to feature a Nordic theme, and it was a sensation. Suddenly, Lagertha was back in the cultural consciousness, reimagined for a new era. But it was really in the 21st century that Lagertha became a household name, thanks to the television series Vikings. The show, which premiered in 2013 on the History Channel, was created by Michael Hurst and told the story of Ragnar Lothbrok and his family. And in the show Lagertha, played by the Canadian actress Catherine Winnick, was not a minor character. She was one of the central figures, a fierce warrior and a complex, compelling woman who evolved over the course of the series. The Vikings version of Lagertha draws on Saxo's account but expands it significantly. She starts as a farmer and shield-maiden, married to Ragnar, and fighting alongside him in his early raids. When Ragnar betrays her by sleeping with another woman, she divorces him and eventually becomes an earl, ruling her own territory. Later she becomes a queen, leading armies, making alliances, navigating the brutal politics of the Viking world. She's a survivor, a fighter, a leader. She's also a mother, a friend, a lover. She's allowed to be complicated, to make mistakes, to grow and change. The show doesn't shy away from violence or from the harsh realities of the Viking Age. Lagertha kills, both in battle and in cold blood. She's ruthless when she needs to be, but she's also compassionate, loyal, protective of those she loves. She's not a one-dimensional warrior woman. She's a fully realized character, and Winnick's performance brought her to life in a way that resonated with millions of viewers around the world. Lagertha became a feminist icon. She was a woman who didn't need a man to define her, who could hold her own in any fight, who commanded respect through her actions. Fans of the show loved her, and when the series eventually killed her off in the later seasons, the reaction was intense. Many felt that her death was anticlimactic, that a character as powerful as Lagertha deserved a more heroic end. The showrunners received angry letters and social media posts. Some fans even said they stopped watching the show after Lagertha died. That level of attachment speaks to how powerful the character had become. Lagertha, in her modern incarnation, represents something that a lot of people, especially women, hunger for, a model of female strength that doesn't require abandoning femininity, a hero who can be nurturing and deadly, strategic and passionate, a leader and a warrior. She's a rejection of the idea that women have to choose between being strong and being feminine, between being warriors and being mothers, between power and compassion. And while the Vikings version of Lagertha takes a lot of creative liberties with Saxo's account, it's true to the spirit of the legend. It captures that sense of a woman who refuses to be constrained, who carves out her own path, who survives and thrives in a brutal world. In that sense, the modern Lagertha is a worthy successor to the medieval one, even if the details are different. So what do we take away from all this? What does Lagertha's story mean for us, here in the 21st century, more than 1,000 years after she supposedly lived? I think there are several lessons, or at least several things worth thinking about. First, Lagertha reminds us that women have always been more than the roles that society assigns to them. Even in the Viking Age, even in a culture that was undeniably patriarchal, there were women who defied expectations, who took up swords, who led armies, who ruled kingdoms. They may have been exceptional, they may have been rare, but they existed, and their stories, whether strictly historical or not, were told and retold because they mattered. They represented a possibility, a dream maybe, but also a challenge to the status quo. Second, Lagertha's story illustrates the power of narrative. We don't know if she was real, but in a way it doesn't matter. Her story has inspired people for centuries. It's inspired playwrights and choreographers and television writers. It's inspired women who see themselves in her, who draw strength from her example. Stories shape culture. They shape how we see ourselves and each other. They expand our sense of what's possible. And a story like Lagertha's, a story about a woman who was strong and fierce and uncompromising, is a story that needs to be told, regardless of its historical accuracy. Third, Lagertha forces us to confront our own assumptions about gender and power. Why is it so hard for us to believe that Viking women might have been warriors? Why did archaeologists assume for over a century that the Birka grave must belong to a man, even when there was no direct evidence for that assumption? Why do we default to the idea that warfare is inherently masculine, that leadership is inherently masculine, that courage and strength are inherently masculine? Lagertha's story, whether she was real or not, challenges those assumptions. It asks us to imagine a world where those qualities are not gendered, where anyone, regardless of their sex, can embody them. And finally, Lagertha's story is about agency. It's about a woman who made her own choices, who shaped her own destiny, who refused to be a passive figure in someone else's story. She chose to fight. She chose to marry Ragnar, on her own terms. She chose to divorce him when the marriage no longer served her. She chose to come to his aid when he needed her, not out of obligation, but out of her own sense of loyalty or strategy or honor. She chose to kill her husband and seize power, because she wanted to rule alone. Those choices were violent sometimes, they were ruthless, they were morally complicated, but they were hers. Lagertha was nobody's victim, she was nobody's pawn. She was the author of her own life, and that, more than anything else, is what makes her story so powerful. Lagertha's story doesn't have a neat ending. We don't know how she died or when, or whether she died peacefully or in battle. We don't know if she was remembered by her people, if songs were sung about her, if her name was carved on runestones. Saxo leaves her at the moment of her greatest triumph, ruling Norway, and then the narrative moves on. She fades into the mist, just like she came out of it. Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe Lagertha, like so many figures from the Viking Age, is meant to remain a mystery. She exists at the edge of what we can know, in that liminal space where history blurs into legend, where fact and fiction become indistinguishable. And maybe that's where she belongs, maybe the ambiguity is the point, because Lagertha isn't just one woman, one historical figure. She's an archetype, a symbol, an idea. She's the shield-maiden, the woman warrior, the figure who refuses to accept the limitations that society places on her. She's the part of us that wants to break free, to be brave, to fight for what we believe in. She's the voice that says, "I will not be constrained, I will not be quiet, I will not accept a role that's too small for me." And that voice, that spirit, that refusal to be anything other than fully, ferociously ourselves, that's what makes Lagertha's story eternal. It's why we keep telling it, keep returning to it, keep finding new meanings in it. It's why a medieval legend can inspire a 21st century television show, can spark academic debates, can become a symbol for modern feminism. Lagertha the historical figure may or may not have existed. Lagertha the legend, the archetype, the symbol, she's very real. She's as real as any story that's been told and retold for over 800 years. She's as real as the impact she has on people who hear her tale, who see themselves in her, who draw strength from her example. And in the end, maybe that's the only kind of reality that truly matters. The idea of the shield-maiden, of women warriors in the Viking Age, has taken on a life of its own in modern culture. It's everywhere now, in books, in movies, in video games, in television shows. We have a seemingly insatiable appetite for stories about fierce Norse women, about Valkyries and warriors and queens who refuse to be sidelined. Some of this is driven by a desire for representation, for seeing women in roles that have traditionally been reserved for men. There's a hunger for female characters who are strong, who fight, who lead, who are heroes in their own right rather than love interests or supporting characters. The shield-maiden archetype provides that. It's a historical, or at least quasi-historical framework for telling stories about powerful women. But there's also a danger here, and it's worth acknowledging. When we romanticize the shield-maiden, when we turn her into a symbol of female empowerment without acknowledging the complexity and brutality of the Viking Age, we risk creating a fantasy that's just as limiting as the stereotypes we're trying to escape. Real Viking women, whether they were warriors or not, lived in a society that was violent, hierarchical, and patriarchal. They had more rights and freedoms than women in many other medieval cultures. Yes, but they were still constrained by their society's norms and expectations. And the women who did break those norms, who did take up weapons and fight, were likely seen as anomalies, as exceptions, not as representatives of a widespread phenomenon. The shield-maiden is a powerful image, but she's also an outlier. She's the exception that proves the rule, and if we're not careful, we can end up using her to erase the experiences of the vast majority of Viking women who lived out their lives without ever picking up a sword, who managed farms and raised children and wielded power in different, less visible ways. That's not to say we shouldn't celebrate Lagertha and women like her. We absolutely should. Their stories are important, their courage is inspiring, their refusal to be constrained is admirable. But we should also remember that there are many ways to be strong, many ways to be powerful, many ways to live a life that matters. Not every woman has to be a warrior to be a hero. To truly understand what it would mean for Lagertha or any woman to be a Viking warrior, we need to understand the weapons and fighting techniques of the time. This wasn't modern warfare with guns and artillery where physical strength matters less. This was close-quarters combat where you looked your enemy in the face as you tried to kill them. Let's start with the most iconic Viking weapon, the sword. Viking swords were magnificent pieces of craftsmanship, often pattern-welded, meaning they were made by twisting together multiple strips of iron and steel to create a blade that was both flexible and hard, resistant to breaking but capable of holding a sharp edge. A good sword might have a name, passed down through generations of warriors. It represented not just a weapon, but family history, honor, legacy. But here's the thing about swords. They were expensive, really expensive. The iron had to be smelted, the blade forged and folded and shaped and sharpened, the pommel and crossguard fitted, the hilt wrapped. It took skilled craftsmen and precious materials. Most Vikings, most warriors couldn't afford a sword. If you owned one, you were wealthy, high status, someone of importance. The average Viking warrior was more likely to carry a spear and an axe. Spears were cheap, easy to make and devastatingly effective. A spear gave you reach, letting you strike an enemy from a distance. You could thrust with it, keeping your shield up for protection, while you stabbed at any opening in your opponent's defense. You could also throw it, though most warriors probably preferred to keep their spear for the whole battle rather than hurl it away for one thrown attack. Axes came in various forms. There was the simple wood-cutting axe, a tool that doubled as a weapon. Every household had axes for chopping firewood and felling trees, and in a pinch, those same axes could split skulls as easily as they split logs. But there were also dedicated battle axes, with longer handles for better reach and specialized blade shapes optimized for combat rather than woodcutting. One particularly distinctive weapon was the Danish axe, a long-handled battle axe that became popular in the later Viking Age. This weapon, wielded with both hands, could deliver crushing blows with tremendous force. It could shear through shields, break bones through mail armor, decapitate a man with a single stroke. But it required you to give up your shield, to fight with both hands on the axe handle, which made you more vulnerable to enemy attacks. Every warrior carried a shield. This was non-negotiable. Your shield was your primary defense, more important than any armor. Viking shields were round, typically about 80 to 100 centimeters in diameter, made of wood planks glued or nailed together, and then rimmed with leather or rawhide to keep the wood from splitting. In the center was an iron boss, a dome that protected your hand, which gripped the shield from behind. Shields were lighter than you might expect. They had to be light enough to hold up for extended periods of fighting, because battles could last hours. But they were also strong enough to stop sword cuts and spear thrusts. The wood absorbed the shock of impacts, and a well-made shield could take a lot of punishment before becoming useless. Now you might have armor if you were wealthy enough. Mail shirts, called byrni in Old Norse, were made of thousands of interlocking iron rings, each one individually forged and riveted closed. A byrni could weigh 15 or 20 pounds or more, and it provided excellent protection against cuts and slashes. Arrows had trouble penetrating good mail. Sword cuts that might otherwise be lethal would bruise instead of cutting. But mail was even more expensive than swords. Only wealthy warriors, jarls and kings and their best fighters could afford it. Most warriors fought in padded cloth or leather at best, maybe with a helmet if they were lucky, but often without any armor at all beyond the clothes on their back and the shield in their hand. Helmets, when they existed, were simple. Forget the horned helmets you see in movies and cartoons. Those are pure fantasy, a 19th century romantic invention. Real Viking helmets were more like caps of iron or steel, sometimes with a nose guard, designed to protect the skull from being split open. Many warriors couldn't afford helmets and fought bareheaded, relying on their shield to protect their head along with the rest of their body. So, could a woman fight effectively with these weapons? Let's think through this carefully. Swords require technique more than strength. You're not trying to club someone to death with a sword. You're trying to cut or thrust at vulnerable points, to slip your blade past their defense and into their flesh. A skilled swordsman or swordswoman uses leverage, timing, and precision. Yes, strength helps, but skill matters more. A woman trained in swordsmanship could absolutely be effective with a blade. Spears might actually favor someone with less upper body strength. The spear is a leverage weapon. You're not overpowering your enemy. You're using the length of the shaft to generate force with relatively little effort. Quick thrusts, keeping your distance, using the point to probe for openings. These are techniques that don't depend on raw strength as much as on speed and accuracy. Axes are trickier. A heavy battle axe requires strength to wield effectively, especially if you're swinging it repeatedly in prolonged combat. But remember, not all axes were massive two-handed weapons. A one-handed axe could be used from behind a shield, and it required less strength than you might think. Again, technique matters. You're not trying to chop down a tree, you're trying to hook someone's shield out of the way or catch your blade in someone's neck or leg. The shield is crucial. This is your defense, your protection, and using it effectively is a skill that has nothing to do with gender. You need to know how to angle it to deflect attacks, how to keep it between you and your enemy, how to use it as a weapon by bashing with the rim or the boss. Shield work is about positioning, awareness, and practice. Training would have been essential. A woman who wanted to fight couldn't just pick up a sword and expect to survive. She'd need to train, to practice, to learn the techniques, and develop the muscle memory and the stamina. How would that training have happened? In Viking society, boys learned to fight from their fathers and older male relatives, through play fighting and sparring that gradually became more serious as they grew older. By the time a boy reached adolescence, he'd have years of experience with weapons, at least in a practice context. His first real battle might be terrifying, but at least he'd have the basic skills. A girl wouldn't have received this training automatically. It wasn't part of the expected female upbringing. But if a girl wanted to learn, if she had family members willing to teach her, there's no reason she couldn't have developed the same skills. It would have been unusual, transgressive even, but not impossible. And once she had the skills, once she could hold her own in a practice fight, why couldn't she hold her own in a real battle? The chaos of combat is terrible and terrifying for everyone. Men died from fear and panic as much as from enemy weapons. If a woman had the courage to stand in the shield wall to face the enemy, to keep fighting when every instinct screamed at her to run, then she could be just as effective as any man beside her. Maybe more effective in some ways. The psychological impact of seeing a woman in battle, especially in a culture where that was so unexpected, could be significant. It would be startling, unnerving, maybe even terrifying in a supernatural way. Lagertha's flying hair, the detail Saxo emphasizes, would have identified her as female even in the midst of battle. And that identification, that realization that you were facing a woman warrior, might create a moment of hesitation, a split second of uncertainty that could mean the difference between life and death. So yes, a woman could fight effectively in Viking Age warfare. It would be difficult, it would be exceptional, it would require training and skill and tremendous courage. But it was possible. And the more we learn about Viking society, about their weapons and their tactics and their burial practices, the more evidence we find that at least some women did exactly that. To truly understand Lagertha's significance, we need to understand what warfare looked like in the Viking Age. This wasn't the organized, disciplined warfare of Rome or the later medieval period. This was brutal, personal, close-quarters combat, where survival depended on individual skill, courage, and luck. Viking battles began with missile weapons. Archers would loose arrows into the enemy ranks, and warriors would hurl spears, trying to thin the opposing forces before the real fighting began. But the arrow volleys and spear throws were just the prelude. The main event was the shield wall, that iconic formation where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, creating a moving fortress of wood and iron. Imagine standing in that shield wall. You can hear the breathing of the man next to you. Feel the press of bodies behind you, pushing you forward. Your shield is heavy, maybe a meter across, made of wood planked together with an iron boss in the center to protect your hand. In your other hand, you might have a spear, a sword, or an axe. You can smell the sweat, the leather, the metal, the fear. And then the shield walls meet with a crash that sounds like thunder. The front ranks slam together, shields bashing against shields, weapons stabbing and hacking at any opening, any exposed flesh. Men grunt and shout and scream. The wounded fall, and others step over them or on them to fill the gaps in the line. It's chaos and noise and violence, and it's exhausting. A battle might last minutes or hours, but even minutes in the shield wall feel like an eternity. This is where Lagertha supposedly fought. This is the environment where, according to Saxo, she excelled. She wasn't commanding from a distance or sitting safely in the rear. She was at the front, in the thick of it, with her hair flying loose and her weapon in hand. Saxo specifically says she fought in front among the bravest, which means she was in the most dangerous position, the place where the fighting was fiercest. For a woman to fight in that environment, she would need to be strong, yes, but strength alone wouldn't be enough. She'd need skill, training, and experience. She'd need to know how to use her shield to block attacks, how to strike with economy and precision, how to read the flow of battle and adjust her position accordingly. She'd need endurance, the ability to keep fighting even when her arms felt like lead and her lungs burned from exertion. And perhaps most importantly, she'd need courage, the ability to stand her ground when every instinct screamed at her to run. Now there's a question that always comes up when we talk about women warriors in the Viking Age. Could a woman physically compete with male warriors in hand-to-hand combat? After all, men on average are larger and stronger than women. That's biological fact. So how could a woman like Lagertha hold her own in a shield wall against male opponents? The answer is more complicated than you might think. Yes, male warriors generally had advantages in size and upper body strength, but warfare isn't just about raw strength. It's about technique, leverage, timing, and positioning. A smaller, weaker fighter who knows what they're doing can absolutely defeat a larger, stronger opponent who doesn't. Ask any martial artist, any modern soldier, any medieval combat historian. Skill matters more than strength, especially in the chaos of battle. Moreover, we shouldn't assume that every male Viking warrior was some towering, muscle-bound giant. Many were farmers and fishermen, people who were strong from labor but not necessarily trained warriors. Some were young men on their first raid, inexperienced and terrified. Some were older men past their physical prime. A woman who had trained seriously with weapons, who had actual combat experience, might well have been more dangerous than the average man who showed up for a fight. There's also the factor of what we might call psychological warfare. Imagine you're a Swedish warrior facing off against what you think is a male opponent, and then you realize it's a woman. That moment of surprise, that split second of hesitation or confusion, could be enough for her to land a killing blow. And beyond that, there's the simple fact that seeing a woman in battle, especially one who's killing your comrades, would be deeply unsettling in a culture where women weren't supposed to fight. It would be unnatural, uncanny, almost supernatural. Saxo hints at this when he describes how warriors marveled at Lagertha's deeds. She wasn't just skilled, she was transgressive, and that gave her a kind of psychological edge. All of this is speculation, of course. We don't know if Lagertha really fought or how she fought if she did, but understanding the realities of Viking warfare helps us appreciate just how extraordinary the claim is that a woman not only fought, but excelled, that she led others and won battles through her tactical acumen. One aspect of Lagertha's legend that often gets overlooked in favor of her prowess as a warrior is her skill as a strategist. Saxo doesn't just describe her as brave or strong. He describes her as tactically brilliant, capable of reading a battle and making the right decision at the right moment. Consider the battle where she saves Ragnar. According to Saxo, Ragnar's forces are losing. His son Sigurd is wounded. The army is on the verge of breaking, of routing, which in ancient warfare often meant death. Once a shield wall broke, once men turned and ran, they became easy targets for the pursuing enemy. Most casualties in ancient battles happened during the rout, not during the actual fighting. This is a crisis moment. This is when leadership matters most. And it's Lagertha who steps up. She doesn't just charge into the enemy or try to hold the line. She does something smarter. She made a sally about and flew round to the rear of the enemy, taking them unawares. This is a flanking maneuver, and it's exactly the kind of tactic that wins battles. While the enemy is focused on pushing forward, on breaking through Ragnar's weakening line, Lagertha circles around with her forces and hits them from behind. Suddenly, the enemy isn't pushing forward anymore. They're surrounded, confused, fighting on two fronts. The psychological impact of being attacked from the rear is devastating. It creates panic, and panic in a shield wall is contagious. The description Saxo gives is brief, but it reveals a lot. Lagertha isn't just a brawler. She's a commander who understands the tactical situation, who can see the whole battlefield, who can identify the opportunity and seize it. This is the kind of skill you'd expect from an experienced military leader, someone who has not just fought in battles, but studied warfare, thought about tactics, learned from experience. It's worth noting that flanking maneuvers require more than just tactical insight. They require discipline and organization. Lagertha had to pull her forces out of the main battle without the enemy noticing. She had to move them around the battlefield, keeping them together and under control, which in the chaos of combat is no easy feat. Then she had to time the attack perfectly, hitting the enemy at the moment when it would do the most damage. Too early, and the enemy might be able to adjust. Too late, and Ragnar's forces might have already broken. The fact that Saxo credits Lagertha with this maneuver, that he doesn't give the credit to some male subordinate or suggest that she was just following someone else's plan, is significant. He's acknowledging her as a military mind, as someone capable of command decisions. In medieval literature, that's a rare thing for a female character. This aspect of Lagertha's character, her strategic intelligence, is part of what makes her more than just a generic warrior woman. She's not just strong or brave. She's smart. She's a leader. She's someone who can think under pressure and make decisions that save lives and win wars. And that arguably is more impressive than any individual feat of arms. Let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the reality of women's lives in the Viking Age, because understanding the norm helps us appreciate how radical the exception was. Most Viking women, the vast majority of them, never fought in battles. Their lives centered around the household, and specifically around textile production. This might sound mundane, even boring, but it was actually incredibly important economically and socially. Textile production in the Viking Age was women's work almost exclusively. Women raised sheep, sheared them, processed the wool, spun it into thread, and wove it into cloth. This was time-consuming, skilled labor. It took hours to produce even a small amount of thread, days to weave a simple garment, weeks or months to create the sails for a longship. And those sails were essential. Without sails, there's no Viking Age, no raids on England or Francia, no exploration of Iceland and Greenland and North America. So women's work, in a very real sense, made the Viking expansion possible. The cloth they produced clothed their families, protected them from the brutal Scandinavian winters. The sails they wove powered the ships that carried warriors and traders across the seas. The surplus cloth they created could be sold or traded, generating wealth for the household. A woman who was skilled at spinning and weaving was valuable, both to her family and to her community. But textile production was also a marker of gender. It was something women did, something that defined femininity in Viking culture. A woman who spun and wove was fulfilling her role, conforming to expectations. It was respectable, necessary, honorable. So when a woman picked up a sword instead of a spindle, when she went to war instead of staying at the loom, she was crossing a profound boundary. She was rejecting her assigned role, turning her back on women's work. And that rejection had meaning. It was a statement. It was transgressive. This is why the detail about Lagertha's hair is so important. In Saxo's description, her hair is loose, flying behind her as she fights. For a Viking woman, hair was a marker of status and gender. Married women typically kept their hair bound up and covered. To have it loose was unusual, associated with either unmarried girls or with moments of ritual or emotional extremity. Lagertha fighting with her hair loose is a visual representation of her transgression. She's literally unbounded, unconstrained by the normal markers of femininity. There's an interesting contrast here between the tools of women's work and the tools of war. A spindle and a sword are both made of wood and metal. Both require skill to use effectively. But they produce very different things. One creates cloth, a thing of utility and comfort. The other creates corpses, a thing of destruction and trauma. One is associated with the home, with safety, with the nurturing and provision of family. The other is associated with the battlefield, with danger, with the violent defense or expansion of territory. A woman who chose the sword over the spindle was choosing destruction over creation, violence over nurture, the battlefield over the home. In a culture that prized both warriors and mothers, that valued both courage and domesticity, this choice was deeply complicated. It was admirable, maybe, but also disturbing. It was impressive, but also unnatural. And this is part of why shield maidens in Norse literature are often portrayed with a mixture of admiration and unease. They're heroic, yes, they're brave and skilled, but they're also anomalies, aberrations, figures who exist outside the normal social order. They're liminal, existing on the boundary between categories, and in pre-modern societies, liminal figures were always both fascinating and frightening. One of the sadder aspects of Lagertha's story is how little we know about her children. Saxo tells us she had 3 children with Ragnar, 2 daughters whose names he doesn't bother to record, and a son named Fridleif. And then, after mentioning their existence, he says almost nothing else about them. We don't know what happened to Lagertha's daughters. Did they stay with her when she and Ragnar divorced? Did they go with their father? Did they marry, have children of their own, live out their lives in obscurity? We don't know. They're footnotes, not even footnotes, ghosts in the narrative, present only in the bare fact of their existence. As for Fridleif, we know slightly more, but only slightly. In other sources, there are mentions of a Fridleif who became a Danish king, and some scholars think this might be Lagertha's son, though the timeline is murky and the evidence is thin. If it is the same Fridleif, then Lagertha's son went on to rule Denmark, which would make her the mother of a king. That's not nothing. That's a legacy, a continuation of power across generations. But we don't get any sense of Lagertha as a mother in Saxo's account. We don't see her raising her children, teaching them, preparing them for the world. We don't see her worried about them, or proud of them, or grieving for them. She's a warrior, a queen, a wife, a murderer. But as a mother, she's absent from the narrative, even though we know she bore children. This absence is telling. Motherhood was one of the most important roles a woman could have in Viking society. Bearing children, especially sons, was how a woman secured her place in the family and the community. It was how she ensured that her lineage continued, that she would be remembered. But for Lagertha, at least in Saxo's telling, motherhood is secondary to her identity as a warrior and a ruler. Her children exist, but they're not central to her story. She's not defined by them. This is unusual for medieval literature, where women are often defined primarily or exclusively by their relationships to men and children, as wives and mothers and daughters. Lagertha has those relationships, but they don't define her. She defines herself through her actions, her choices, her deeds. Her children are part of her life, but they're not the sum of her life. There's something both liberating and sad about this. Liberating because it means Lagertha is allowed to be more than just a mother, to have an identity and a story that extends beyond her role in producing and raising the next generation. Sad, because it means we don't get to see that aspect of her life, don't get to know her as a mother, don't get to understand how she balanced, if she balanced, the competing demands of warfare and childcare, of ruling and nurturing. In the modern Vikings television show, the writers tried to address this by giving Lagertha a strong maternal identity alongside her identity as a warrior. She loves her children fiercely. She mourns her daughter Gyda when the girl dies of plague. She has a complicated but deep relationship with her son Bjorn, whom she trains as a warrior, but also protects and guides. The show allows Lagertha to be both a shield maiden and a mother, both fierce and nurturing, both a warrior and a woman. Whether the historical or legendary Lagertha experienced motherhood that way, we'll never know. Saxo doesn't tell us, but it's worth thinking about, worth considering how a woman who chose the path of the warrior would have navigated the other roles and identities that were available to her, or imposed upon her, in Viking society. Lagertha's story is inextricably tied to Ragnar Lothbrok, and part of that story involves the women who came after her in Ragnar's life. Understanding these other wives and the relationships between them gives us a richer picture of the dynamics at play. After Lagertha, Ragnar married Thora, the daughter of King Harald of Sweden. The marriage was the result of Ragnar's defeat of the Lindworm, that giant serpent or dragon that guarded Thora. It's a classic fairy tale setup. Hero defeats monster, wins princess. And for a while it seems like Ragnar and Thora were happy together. They had children, though the accounts vary on exactly how many and who they were. In some versions, Thora is the mother of some of Ragnar's famous sons. In others, those sons belong to Aslaug, Ragnar's third wife. Aslaug. She's a fascinating figure in her own right. According to the sagas, Aslaug was the daughter of Sigurd the Dragon Slayer and the Valkyrie Brynhild, which would make her part divine, part legendary hero. She was raised in disguise by a peasant couple who didn't want anyone to know her true identity. When Ragnar encountered her, she was filthy and dressed in rags, but he saw through the disguise to the beauty beneath. Or in some versions, she deliberately revealed her beauty to seduce him. Either way, Ragnar was captivated. According to the sagas, Aslaug was not just beautiful, but also wise, even prophetic. She could see the future, or at least catch glimpses of it, and she promised Ragnar that if he married her, she would bear him sons who would become great warriors and kings. Ragnar, ambitious as always, couldn't resist that promise, so he took Aslaug as his wife. Whether he divorced Thora first or simply took Aslaug as a second wife, effectively making both women his consorts, depends on which version of the story you're reading. Polygamy wasn't unheard of in the Viking world, especially for powerful men, though it was uncommon and often complicated. Now imagine being Lagertha and hearing about all this. Your ex-husband, the man you fought beside, the man you saved in battle, has gone through not one but two more wives since leaving you. He's building his legend, having more children, expanding his power and influence. And you're back in Norway, ruling alongside a husband you apparently didn't even like enough to keep alive. Does Lagertha care? Is she jealous? The sources don't tell us, but Saxo does make a point of saying that when Lagertha came to Ragnar's aid with her 120 ships, she still loved him. That's an interesting detail. Still loved him. Despite the divorce, despite Thora and Aslaug, despite everything, there's apparently lingering feeling there. But if there's love, there's also distance. Lagertha doesn't come back to Ragnar permanently. After the battle, she returns to Norway, to her own kingdom, to her own life. She's not trying to win him back. She's not competing with his other wives for his attention or affection. She helps him because she chooses to, and then she leaves because she chooses to. She's not defined by her relationship to Ragnar, even though he remains a significant figure in her story. This is another way in which Lagertha is unusual in medieval literature. Female characters in stories about male heroes are often either devoted wives or jealous rivals. They either stand by their man through everything, or they scheme and manipulate to maintain their position and destroy their competitors. Lagertha does neither. She loves Ragnar maybe, but she's not subordinate to him. She's not dependent on him. She has her own power, her own kingdom, her own story. Ragnar is part of her life, an important part, but he's not the center of it. And that, more than anything else, is what makes her a compelling character. She's not the heroine of Ragnar's story. Ragnar is a supporting character in her story, even if Saxo doesn't quite frame it that way. Let's talk about Lagertha's name for a moment, because names in the medieval world often carried significant meaning. Saxo writes her name as Lagertha in his Latin text, which most scholars agree is a Latinization of an Old Norse name. The most likely Old Norse form would have been Hlagerda, pronounced something like Hlathgertha. The first element, hlad, could mean protection, or could refer to Hladir, which was a specific place in Norway, the seat of the powerful Jarls of Lade. The second element, gerder, means enclosure, or protection, or possibly yard. So Hladgerda might mean something like protected by Hlad, or guardian of the yard, or simply she who is from Hladir. This last interpretation is particularly interesting because of the connection to Thorgerd, the goddess we talked about earlier. Thorgerd was known as Thorgerda Helgabruder in Old Norse, and she was specifically associated with the Jarls of Lade, who ruled from Hladir. If Lagertha's name really does connect her to that region, it strengthens the theory that she's based on or conflated with stories about Thorgerd. There's also a woman called Hlagerda, who appears in other sagas, though not in connection with Ragnar. In the sagas about the 6th century king Halfdan, there's a woman named Hladgerda, who rules over islands called the Hladijar, and who provides Halfdan with 20 ships to help him fight his enemies. Sound familiar? She's a ruler. She has military resources. She comes to the aid of a king with a fleet of ships. The parallels to Lagertha's story are striking. It's possible that Saxo encountered this other Lagertha story and conflated it with tales about Ragnar Lothbrok, creating the Lagertha we know. Or it's possible that both Lagerthas are based on the same legendary figure, a woman whose story was told and retold and eventually attached to different kings and different eras. Or it's possible that Lagertha was simply a common name or a title, and there were multiple women who bore it. The linguistic evolution of the name is also interesting. Lagertha in Old Norse would have been pronounced with a breathy L sound at the beginning, a sound that doesn't exist in Latin or most modern European languages. So when Saxo tried to write it down in Latin, he approximated it as Lagertha, losing that initial H sound and adjusting the spelling to fit Latin conventions. Later writers, working from Saxo's Latin text, further modified it to Lagertha, which is the form that's now most common in English. So the name itself has gone through transformations, just like the story it's attached to. It's been Latinized, anglicized, modified to fit the sounds and conventions of different languages and different eras. And in each transformation, something is lost and something is gained. We're further from the original, whatever that was, but we have a name that's easier for modern audiences to remember and pronounce. There's a metaphor there, maybe, for how legends work. They change as they're passed down. They adapt to new contexts, new audiences, new languages and cultures. They lose some details and gain others. And eventually, you end up with something that's quite different from where you started, but that still carries some essential spark of the original. Lagertha and the Norse shield-maidens weren't the only warrior women in world mythology and legend. Across cultures and across history, there are stories of women who fought, who led armies, who refused to be confined to domestic roles. Looking at some of these other figures helps us understand what made Lagertha unique and what she shares with a broader archetype. The most famous warrior women in Western mythology are probably the Amazons of Greek legend. These were a tribe or nation of women warriors who lived somewhere on the edges of the known world, possibly in Scythia or along the Black Sea. According to Greek myths, the Amazons were fierce fighters who rejected marriage and male authority. Some stories said they cut off their right breasts to make it easier to draw a bow, though this detail is probably more symbolic than factual. The Amazons appear in numerous Greek myths. They fought against Hercules, Theseus, and other heroes. Their queen, Penthesilea, came to the aid of Troy during the Trojan War and was killed by Achilles, who then mourned her because she was so brave and beautiful. The Greeks were fascinated by the Amazons, but also deeply uncomfortable with them. They represented an inversion of the natural order, a world where women ruled and men were subordinate or absent. The Greeks told stories about heroes defeating Amazons, symbolically reasserting male dominance and the proper order of things. Saxo definitely knew about the Amazons, and when he describes Lagertha as a skilled Amazon, he's deliberately invoking that comparison. He's signaling to his readers that Lagertha is part of this tradition of warrior women, this archetype that exists across cultures and mythologies. But there are differences between Lagertha and the Amazons. The Amazons were a separate society, a nation of women who lived apart from men. Lagertha, on the other hand, lived within Viking society. She fought alongside men, married a man, had children. She wasn't rejecting men entirely or trying to create some women-only utopia. She was simply claiming for herself the right to do things that were normally reserved for men while still participating in other aspects of society. Moving east, we find the women warriors of Celtic mythology. The Irish legends, in particular, are full of fierce women who fought and trained male warriors. There's Scathach, the legendary warrior woman who trained the hero Cu Chulainn in the arts of war on the Isle of Skye. There's Aif, another warrior woman and Scathach's rival, who Cu Chulainn fought and defeated and then seduced. There's Maeve, or Medb, the queen of Connaught, who led armies and wasn't afraid to fight personally when necessary. These Celtic warrior women are interesting because, like Lagertha, they exist within their societies, rather than apart from them. They're queens, teachers, rivals, mothers. They have relationships with men that are complicated, sometimes antagonistic, sometimes romantic, but always based on a certain fundamental equality or even rivalry. They're not separate or other. They're integrated into the world of the myths, just claiming roles that would normally be male. In Asia, We have figures like Hua Mulan from Chinese legend, the young woman who disguised herself as a man to take her aging father's place in the army and fought for 12 years before revealing her true identity and returning home. Or Tomoe Gozen from Japanese history, a female samurai who fought in the Genpei War in the 12th century and was renowned for her skill and bravery. What's interesting about these Asian examples is that they often involve disguise or deception. Mulan has to pretend to be a man to fight. Tomoe Gozen was exceptional precisely because she was a woman fighting in a male-dominated sphere, and contemporary accounts express surprise at her existence. In the Norse context, with Lagertha and other shield maidens, there's often an element of disguise too, women dressing in men's clothing, wearing men's armor. But there's also this moment of revelation, when the hair flies loose or the armor is removed and everyone realizes she's a woman. And that revelation, that moment of recognition, is part of the power of the story. Across all these cultures, across all these myths and legends, there's a common thread. The warrior woman is transgressive. She's breaking rules, crossing boundaries, claiming a space that's not supposed to be hers. And societies respond to that transgression with a mixture of admiration and anxiety, celebration and condemnation. The warrior woman is heroic, yes, but she's also dangerous, unsettling, a challenge to the established order. Lagertha fits into this tradition. She's part of a global archetype, the woman who refuses to be confined by gender roles, who picks up a weapon and fights. But she's also distinctly Norse, shaped by the specific culture and values of the Viking world. She's not an Amazon living in a separate society. She's not disguising herself for 12 years. She's openly a woman and openly a warrior, fighting with her hair flying behind her, so everyone knows exactly who and what she is. She's claiming her place as a warrior while remaining undeniably female. And that's what makes her story so powerful and so enduring. We've traveled a long road tonight, from the cold shores of 9th century Norway to the archaeological sites of modern Sweden, from the pages of a medieval Latin history to the set of a 21st century television show. We've explored questions of history and myth, examined the evidence for Viking women warriors, delved into the complexities of gender in the Viking Age, and situated Lagertha within a broader tradition of warrior women across world mythology. We've met a woman who may or may not have existed, who may have been a warrior or a queen or a goddess, or simply a story told by skillful saga tellers. We've grappled with questions about history and myth, about gender and power, about what it means to be remembered. Lagertha, whoever or whatever she was, has left a mark. Her story has endured for over 800 years, and it shows no sign of fading. She's been reimagined and reinvented with each new generation, each new telling. She's been a cautionary tale and a hero's journey, a symbol of chaos and a symbol of strength. She's been a footnote in a larger narrative and the central figure in her own story. And through it all she remains elusive, mysterious, just out of reach. We can't pin her down. We can't say with certainty who she was or what she did. But maybe that's the secret of her power. Maybe the mystery is what keeps us coming back, what keeps us telling her story, what keeps us finding new meanings in the legend of the shield-maiden who fought beside Ragnar Lothbrok and ruled a kingdom alone. In a way, Lagertha is a mirror. When we look at her, we see what we want to see, what we need to see. We see courage or ambition or ruthlessness or strength. We see a woman who refused to accept the limits placed on her, who carved out her own path, who lived and died on her own terms. We see a challenge, a question, a possibility. What would you do, she seems to ask, if the world told you that you couldn't do something because of who you were? Would you accept it? Would you find another path? Or would you fight? Would you refuse? Would you become a shield maiden in your own right, whatever that means for you? Lagertha doesn't give us answers. She only asks questions. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift a legend can give us. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the legend of Lagertha. If you enjoyed this exploration of Norse mythology and Viking history, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more myths to explore, so many more forgotten corners of history waiting to be rediscovered. And I'd love to have you along for the journey. Until next time, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember, Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we can never quite prove are true. Good night.